Today we're diving into beneficial ownership transparency.
Yes.
Specifically, we're going to zero in on the Middle East and Africa.
Yes.
It's a fascinating area because this region has a really interesting mix of emerging efforts and unique geopolitical and economic landscapes.
Absolutely. And I think you see that playing out in how governments are trying to grapple with these international standards for beneficial ownership transparency,
Right.
while also kind of navigating their own specific regional complexities when it comes to tackling financial crime.
Right. So we've gathered a lot of information here on 9 countries. We're going to look at
All right.
the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, Egypt, South Africa, Iran, Pakistan, and Kazakhstan.
Sounds good.
And our mission here is to really just kind of extract the most important aspect of the UBO regulations
Yeah.
in these countries.
Yeah.
And give our listeners like a clear and concise overview without getting lost in the weeds.
Yes, cut through the noise.
Yeah, cut through the noise. So let's jump right in. Let's start with the UAE.
Okay.
When we talk about beneficial ownership in the UAE, what's like the core reporting requirement?
So in the UAE, the key thing is disclosure of beneficial owners who hold 25% or more of a company's shares or voting rights.
Okay, 25% or more.
Yeah, and this is really driven by their AML and CTF measures.
Right, AML,
Yeah.
anti-money laundering, counterterrorism financing.
Counterterrorism financing, that's right.
So just to give our listeners a quick reminder about AML and CTF, AML is all about stopping dirty money from being disguised.
Yes.
And CTF is about preventing funds from supporting terrorist activities.
That's right. So basically preventing the financing of terrorism.
Okay, so those are 2 really important measures that a lot of these countries are grappling with.
Absolutely. They're kind of global standards that are being implemented and adapted to local contexts.
Okay, so in the UAE, 25% or more. You have to disclose that. Where does that information go?
So that information gets reported to the UAE Beneficial Ownership Register, and that's under the company's registration office, or CRO, and that was launched relatively recently in 2020.
Okay, so pretty new.
Yeah, fairly new.
So they have this register. Can just anyone access it?
That's a good question. Access to this register is restricted?
Okay, so it's not public.
No. So while the information is collected, it's not publicly available.
Got it.
Which is an interesting kind of nuance when we talk about transparency.
Right.
Because there are different levels of transparency, right? You can have transparency to authorities, but not necessarily public transparency.
Interesting.
What's also interesting about the UAE is they don't have a fully implemented PSC register yet.
And for our listeners, what is a PSC register?
Right. So a PSC register is a person with significant control register, and it aims to identify those individuals who exert significant influence over a company, even if they don't hold a majority of shares.
So even if you don't meet that 25% threshold.
Exactly. You could still be a PSC if you have significant influence in other ways.
Okay, and UAE, they don't have that fully implemented.
Not yet.
Another thing that they don't have is a comprehensive system for tracking the ownership of entities based overseas.
That's right. So foreign entities operating within the UAE. It's not as clear who ultimately owns or controls them.
Okay. Interesting. So a lot of gaps there.
Yeah, there are some gaps there.
All right, let's move over to Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
How does their system compare to what we're seeing in the UAE?
So Saudi Arabia also operates with that 25% threshold for disclosing beneficial owners. And that falls under their AML regulations. And this information is reported to the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, or SAMA.
Okay.
They launched their beneficial ownership register a bit later in 2022.
Okay.
And it falls under the Chamber of Commerce there.
Okay, so similar timeline as the UAE.
Yeah, roughly around the same time.
In terms of when they launched it. How about access?
Access is also restricted in Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so again, not public.
Right. And like the UAE, they don't have a fully implemented PSC register.
Yeah.
And they also don't have a system to effectively track who owns these foreign entities involved in their economy.
Okay, so very similar to the UAE.
Yeah, very similar limitations.
It seems like we're seeing a trend here in terms of who gets to see this information. Let's look at Israel. What's their approach?
So Israel's framework is rooted in their law for the prevention of money laundering. And they also have that 25% or more disclosure requirement.
Okay.
What's quite notable about Israel is that they do have a PSC register,
Okay.
but it's only accessible by authorities.
So there's like a layer of government oversight.
Right. It's not open to the public, but at least authorities have that information.
Okay, do they have a broader UBO register?
They do. They have the Israel Beneficial Ownership Register,
Mm-hmm.
which is under the Israel Tax Authority. And that was launched in 2020. However, as with the others that we've discussed so far, access to this register is also restricted.
Okay, so still no public-facing register there
Yeah,
either.
not yet.
And one more thing. Do they track entities outside of Israel?
So they don't specifically track entities based outside of Israel.
So another gap there.
Yeah, another limitation.
All right, let's turn our attention now to Turkey.
Okay.
Turkey's got a long history. Geographically and politically, how do they approach this?
So Turkey has also aligned itself with that 25% threshold
Okay.
for UBO disclosure.
Yeah.
And that's part of their AML regulations. They established the Turkey Ultimate Beneficial Ownership Register, which falls under the Revenue Administration of Turkey, or JIB.
JIB.
And that was also launched back in 2020.
Okay, so that's pretty consistent. With the other countries we've talked about so far,
Yeah, it seems to be a common trend.
in terms of the timing, and I'm sure you know what question I'm going to ask next.
I think so. Is it publicly accessible?
Exactly. Is it publicly accessible?
And the answer, unfortunately, is no.
Oh, okay.
Access is restricted in Turkey.
All right, so that's a pretty clear theme emerging here. They don't have a fully implemented
You don't know.
PSC register, and there's no public register specifically designed to track overseas entities.
That's right. So those are two key limitations in Turkey.
Okay, so let's move into North Africa now.
Okay.
Take a look at Egypt.
Okay.
What's the situation in Egypt?
So Egypt's AML regulations also require the disclosure of beneficial owners holding 25% or more.
Okay, so again, we're seeing that 25%.
It's a common threshold.
That's the magic number.
Seems to be, yeah. Their ultimate beneficial owner register was launched in 2020, and that's managed by the Commercial Registration Authority.
Okay. And is the pattern continuing here?
I think you know the answer to that.
I think I do, but I want to hear from you.
Access is restricted in Egypt.
Okay.
There's no centralized or public register. There's no PSC register, and no established system to track ownership by entities overseas.
Okay, so very much in line
Yeah, very much in line with what we've seen.
with what we've been seeing. It's interesting to see this recurring kind of approach of establishing these registers, but then limiting who can actually access them.
It's an interesting approach, isn't it?
Yeah. All right, South Africa.
Okay.
South Africa is often seen as being ahead of the curve in certain areas of transparency, within the continent. What does their UBO landscape look like?
So South Africa is definitely a standout case in the region. They also have that 25% threshold.
Okay.
But crucially, they've implemented a publicly available PSC register.
Wow, that's different.
Yeah, that's a big difference. And this is a significant step towards greater transparency. They also have a South Africa Beneficial Ownership Register, which falls under the Companies and Intellectual Property Commission, or CIPC. And that was launched in 2021.
Okay.
But access to this register itself is still restricted.
Interesting. So they've got the public PSC register,
Yes.
but the UBO register is still restricted.
That's right.
What other limitations does South Africa face?
So even with that progress on the PSC register, South Africa doesn't have a specific register designed to track entities based outside of the country. So while it's easier to see who controls domestic companies, the ownership structures involving foreign entities aren't as clear.
Right. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. Talk about Iran.
Okay.
Iran has a very different, political and geopolitical situation. What are the UBO regulations there?
So in Iran, they've actually set a slightly lower reporting threshold of 20%.
Right, so lower than the 25%
Lower than the 25%.
we've been seeing. And their beneficial ownership register was launched under the Iran Financial Intelligence Unit.
Or FIU in 2020.
Okay. Now, considering the international context, with Iran, what's the situation with access and limitations?
So access to their register is restricted.
Okay.
And more broadly, Iran doesn't have
Okay.
a public register or a PSC register. And additionally, the existing international sanctions really create substantial obstacles to achieving transparency, particularly when it comes to understanding foreign ownership structures.
Right, so a lot more complexity there.
Definitely more complex. Yeah.
All right, let's move east over to Pakistan.
Okay.
What's happening in Pakistan?
So Pakistan requires the disclosure of beneficial owners with a 25% threshold.
Okay, back to the 25%.
Back to the 25%, yeah. And their ultimate beneficial owner register was launched under the Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan, or SECP, in 2020.
Okay, what are the key features and limitations there?
So similar to many others in the region, Pakistan has restricted access to its UBO register.
Okay.
They also don't have a centralized UBO register. or separate PSC register, and their ability to track foreign entities is limited.
Okay, so it seems like we're kind of back to the pattern we've been seeing.
Yeah, we're seeing that pattern again.
All right, last stop on our tour. Kazakhstan.
Okay.
Kazakhstan is a,
Yeah.
huge country, lots of natural resources.
Yeah.
What's their approach to beneficial ownership?
So Kazakhstan's regulations also stipulate a 25% threshold
Right.
for disclosure, and they launched their register of beneficial owners of legal entities under the Financial Monitoring Agency, or FMA, in 2023.
Okay, so very recent.
Very recent, yeah. So they're one of the newer countries to kind of implement this type of framework.
Okay, and the big question, transparency and access.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it aligns with the trend we've seen in many of these countries.
Okay.
Access to their register is restricted. They also lack a centralized PSC register. There's no public access to beneficial ownership information. And they don't have a specific register for overseas entities.
Okay, so very similar to
Yeah, very
what
similar.
we've been seeing. So as we kind of wrap up this regional overview, what's the overarching picture that emerges?
So the main takeaway here, I think, is the significant diversity in how these regulations are being approached and implemented. Many nations in the region are in the initial stages of establishing these UBO transparency frameworks.
Wow.
And the primary focus seems to be on putting in place the basic legal requirements for reporting.
Right, so getting the information
Then the information collected, that's right.
What are some of the common challenges that we're seeing?
So we see several recurring themes here. One is just the practical implementation
Right.
of these regulations can be
Okay.
quite complex
Yeah.
and resource intensive.
Right, and then the big one we keep coming back to is
Public access.
public access, right?
Yeah, that's a major one.
Limited public access.
Yeah.
Reduces the overall transparency.
It does, yeah. And then a widespread challenge is just
Yeah.
the absence of effective systems for tracking ownership by entities based outside their borders.
Right, and again, South Africa stands out
South Africa's public PSC register really does stand out
as being a more advanced approach.
as a more advanced approach. It shows a different level of commitment to public transparency.
Right, it feels like we're seeing the foundational steps being taken in a lot of these countries. But there's still a considerable distance to travel to achieve comprehensive and truly effective UBO transparency.
I think that's a fair assessment. The intention is there to increase financial transparency, often driven by these international pressures and the need to combat illicit financial flows. But the actual frameworks are still evolving, and there are significant obstacles.
So as we kind of conclude this deep dive into beneficial ownership, in the Middle East and Africa, the big takeaway here is, while many countries are establishing reporting requirements, those crucial elements of who can access this information and how thoroughly overseas ownership is tracked, that varies considerably.
It does, and I think what's particularly interesting to think about is how the unique geopolitical and economic dynamics of this region really influenced the choices these countries are making.
Right.
Concerns about data security, the need to attract foreign investment, the specific nature of their own financial crime risks. All of these factors likely play a significant role in shaping these regulatory approaches.
All right, so to our listeners out there, we've given you an overview of this really complex landscape. And now I want you to think about, given all these factors, what do you think are the potential future directions for beneficial ownership transparency in this region? And how might these regional efforts ultimately impact or be influenced by the broader global fight against financial crime?
It's a really important question.
It is, and it's something to keep in mind as we continue to explore this topic.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.